Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you so much for coming to our Food Policy for Breakfast seminar series. I want to welcome you virtually to Hunter College here in East Harlem. My name is Charles Platkin, and I'm the director of the New York City Food Policy Center and professor here at Hunter College. Today, we're privileged and honored to have Dr. Marion Nestle as our guest. There is so much I could say about Dr. Marion Nestle. In fact, just her bio could take up the whole hour. But I will say this, and I've said the exact same thing many times before. Marion Nestle is fearless and relentless. She pushes food companies and policymakers to think and care about what, how, and where we eat. She has moxie. You know it the second you meet her. Dr. Marion Nestle is a true food and public health rock star. Dr. Nestle, who has a brand new book, I believe this is her 12th. I counted, but I'm not sure. And I included the medical textbook. This is Slow Cooked, an unexpected life in food politics. Thank you again for joining me here today.
Oh, Charles, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the introduction.
So I want to start out that the book, I read it and it was incredible. It felt like you were sitting over coffee with me and telling me your life story. And I was really captivated from the very beginning. And you brought me right back into, not right back into, but right into the view of a depression child, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it was really exciting. And I guess my first question is, why'd you write the memoir, and was there anything you discovered about yourself, and thinking so deeply about writing about your past and revealing so much personal information, being so vulnerable, and I probably empowered. So what was it? What was it like?
Well, first of all, there was the pandemic, and I moved out of New York City up to Ithaca to be with my partner full time for months and months and months. Ithaca is much quieter than New York, and I really needed a project or something to work on. I'm a nonfiction writer. That means I need research materials. I need the stuff that I've got in my office. I have to be able to get into libraries. I couldn't do any of that during the pandemic. So there I was, stuck in this house, a very lovely house, I'm not complaining, but I needed a project. And I thought, now is the time to answer the questions that I get asked all the time. And I was still getting them during the pandemic. Could you explain how you first got interested in food? How did you get the courage to take on the food industry? When did you decide to take on the food industry? How did you get interested in nutrition? How do you feel about being attacked by the food industry? Those kinds of really personal questions that, I'm sort of passed off. I'd much rather talk about the ideas than talk about me. But I thought, well, maybe this is a time to sit down and grapple with this. And so I talked to my agent about it. I wrote a book proposal. University of California said, sure, let's do it. They had never done a memoir before in their food and culture series. So they were a little leery about it, but they've been great to work with. And so then I started writing it, and it was not easy. I mean, first of all, I had to dig into a lot of very uncomfortable things, and then look at patterns, which in some way I was aware of some of them, but I could see that there were repetitive patterns and ways of dealing with adversity that were very similar that I hadn't been so aware of before. And I don't know, I tried to make it honest.
And it really is incredibly honest. And I assume the questions that you got were not about your childhood, which you really went into. So just going back, what were some of the things the skills that you developed, to overcome adversarial situations, do you think?
Well, I think survival was one of them, and not knowing, if I didn't know what to do, I just waited until it became obvious what needed to be done, that kind of thing. And, and the proverbial she persisted. There's a lot of evidence of persistence in reading. Well, that didn't work. Okay, let's try this. That didn't work. Let's try that. And then also, I think I grew up with a set of values that are very core. I mean, that was also something that, um, people say, well, do you change your mind about things? Yes, I certainly changed my mind about scientific things, the new science that comes in. But I think the core values have been absolutely fixed from day one. And that I've kept those core values all the way through my entire life and career. And that was interesting to see too, because I know lots of people who change their core values, and it's something I've never understood.
And could you just say what those core values are? Just
Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be equality of opportunity. I think everybody deserves a fair shake in life, that poor people are poor because they were born into the wrong families, not because they chose to be poor. Those kinds of things that I was raised with. My parents were members of the Communist Party. You don't get to choose your parents. That's another thing. Um, and and that was very complicated for me growing up, because I thought that the core values that I've just mentioned, those kinds of values, um, really made sense. And then there were other things that were going on that didn't make any sense at all. And it caused a lot of turmoil in the family while I was growing up. I was arguing with my parents about politics when I was 5 years old. You know, how can you say that you believe this, but then this is happening that's in direct contradiction to that? How do you justify that? And their justifications never made sense to me.
right. And I remember you saying that in the book about how you thought that some of the communist values were impressive, but look at what was happening overseas, and that was a conflict for you. So you wrote a lot about your rough childhood, and you grew up in New York until you were 12, I believe, and then moved to California. But there were issues again with your mom, and I'll paraphrase. This is not exactly what you said, but being caustic. um, and you said you weren't very close with your father because he died when you were young, and also um, because he was not around that much.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a family with a very unhappy and critical mother. Um, and many, many years later, when I was in therapy, I interviewed her, to try to find out why she had been so critical of me. And her answer to that was that she thought we were very much alike, and she'd been very unhappy throughout her life, and she didn't want me to be unhappy. So she wanted me to be transformed into somebody else. Good luck with that. That certainly didn't work. And we had been at war from the time I remembered it as being 8, and she remembered it as being 6, but it was not a very happy childhood. And my father was not around because they didn't get along.
Right.
So and then he died when I was 13. And the other interesting thing about was realizing my father was 5'10" and weighed 350 pounds and was a 3-pack a day smoker. Did that have anything to do with my interest in nutrition later on? I wonder about that.
Yeah, and you kind of came to the conclusion you really weren't sure. And then, and I don't know if this is politically correct or not, but you did talk a lot about your hair.
Oh, yes.
And I just thought it'd be interesting to read. You got to get this book, everybody, because it really is excellent. And even if you don't know Marion Nestle, it's worth reading. It's exciting. So anyway, so you
Yeah.
talk about your hair. It's kind of thematic in a way.
Oh, well, it was the bane of my childhood existence. My mother had long straight hair, and my mother was very conventionally pretty. I mean, she was really beautiful when she was young. And so then there was the question of and my father had curly hair. So that's where I got it from. But, what are we going to do with your hair? And nobody knew what to do with curly hair. And she took me to men's barbershops when I was a kid, and they would cut my hair like a boy's. And then everybody would ask me, and the big question I was constantly asked as a child is, are you a girl or a boy? How's that for, you know, let's think about that one. And that was a huge problem for me when I was growing up. And then as I got older, then the question became, what are you going to do about your hair? You have to straighten it. You have to do something. You just have, it was just an enormous, enormous problem. And it's one of the great ironies of my life, because I can tell you that at least 3 or 4 times a week, I get stopped on the subway, stopped on the street, stopped in stores saying, "Oh, your hair is so gorgeous." Go figure.
That is funny. And I guess when you, after you moved to California, you ended up going to a, what you describe as an academic high school. Um, and you said that you really still weren't encouraged to advance your life or career. And you had so much discouragement from the school and from the family. And then you wrote something, which this phrase that you're supposed to marry a professor, a rabbi, or a doctor. And I guess my question is, how come no lawyers? No, I'm kidding. What,
But those were my three best friends in high school, and their lifetime ambition was to marry a professor, a doctor, or a rabbi, in that order. And they did. That's what they did. I mean, and they're all still married to them, as far as I know. I mean, kind of amazing. And I didn't have any such ambitions. I wasn't dating in high school. No, I didn't have any hope of that. And certainly, and I knew one woman in my high school who wanted to be a physicist. And she later, I ran into her years later, and she had married one. Yeah.
that seems to be a common theme in the book, especially the early years, about um, a woman attempting to be a scientist or attempting to do anything really other than, as you describe, as a secretary or being married to somebody, and the struggles that come with that, the gender issues that come with that in academia, in science, and professional life, and kind of, you don't talk about it exactly, but it's described in the things that you do about the ground that you broke as a female, entering in these worlds.
Well, I certainly didn't feel like I was breaking ground. I mean, that wasn't how I interpreted it at all. I was just trying to survive. I went to college. I got married right away. I became sort of, you did what? I got married at 19. You did what? And and then I had children a few years afterwards. And went to graduate school with two small children, and that required survival skills. I mean, I had to juggle children, babysitting, a lab career. I was a lab science. I was trying to be a lab scientist at the time, and with just remarkably little encouragement as I think back on it. Although my lab supervisor was very encouraging, which is probably how I made it through. But I love telling the story that when I had very good grades in college, it was the one thing that I could do really well. And the faculty advisor in my graduate program in molecular biology said, "Well, we have money for a fellowship for you, but that's only because no man applied this year." And next year, when this department transforms from virology to molecular biology, and we'll have a lot of male applicants, then we may have to give the fellowship to somebody else. I think that was normal. It was the kind of thing that was so normal and so expected, and I had no other models. I was the first in my family to go to college. I didn't have any academic models of, since then I've met women who of my age or my era who had a much easier time of it in college and actually went on to careers, but they came from academic families where they knew what was expected and had much better advice than I got. I certainly didn't have, I mean, I was sort of making my way through. Maybe that's what you mean by groundbreaking. I don't know. For me, it was a tunnel, a very long tunnel. Slow cook. That's why it's slow cooked.
And so just from a timeline perspective, so you went to Berkeley, you left for a little bit, then you went back, and then you finished your graduate degree.
Yeah, I dropped out of school to get married, came back a year or so later and finished, and worked as a lab technician for a couple of years, because that's what women did. You know, you were a secretary, you were a teacher, or in my case, you were a lab technician. And then I had kids.
Sorry, and then when did you? What happened that you ended up going to Brandeis?
Well, I finished my graduate work, and by that time, my first marriage had broken up, and I was with somebody else who had a job on the East Coast at Harvard. And I went with him as an accompanying, we weren't spouse then, but you know, a soon-to-be spouse. And I got a job at Brandeis as a postdoctoral fellow and was working in the lab, and had the big, I call it the swimming pool epiphany, which was the realization that I couldn't have a lab career. And that happened, you know, in a cataclysmic incident. My kids went to swimming lessons in the Brandeis pool on Saturday mornings. And usually it was 3/4 of an hour or an hour, and I stayed there while they were during their lesson. But one day, for some reason or other, there was a double lesson, and they were going to be in the pool for about 2 or 3 hours. And I thought, great, I'll go to my lab. Nobody will be there. I'll get some work done. And I walk into my lab, and everybody was there. And I mean, everybody. All of the other postdocs, the graduate students, the lab director, the lab technician, the lab director's wife, everybody was there on Saturday morning. I hadn't known that. Even if I had known it, and even if I had wanted to be there on a Saturday morning, there was no way in the world I could do that. I didn't have childcare. My husband was, you know, had his own lab career, and his was much more important than mine. You know, it was just an impossible situation. And my lab career ended on that morning. That was it. It was perfectly obvious to me that I could not raise children and work in a laboratory and have a laboratory science career at the same time. It was just not going to be possible, because I could see this is why they're always complaining that I'm not getting any work done. And this is why I'm not getting any work done. I'm not putting enough time into it. So that was it. And I was offered a teaching job, and I took it.
Which was really pretty fortuitous. It was pretty fantastic for you, because you were asked to teach undergraduate nutrition. Is that correct? Or
I was handed a nutrition class to teach. You will teach this. In the semester. And because my department had these really strange rules, it was really interesting to think about this. I'd never heard of a department with rules like this. You could only teach the same class 3 times in a row, and then you had to stop and teach something else, and you had to teach whatever the department needed, whether you knew anything about it or not. Because the idea was, you have a doctorate, you can learn more than undergraduate students.
By the way, I've heard that as an academic. I've heard that.
Oh, you have?
Yes, I have. Still to this day, I've heard that if you have a doctorate, you should be able to teach anything. But it's interesting. But it's interesting. There's a message in your book that struck with me, which was this idea of how you learned how to teach almost anything, which is that you would basically go out and get introductory books on the topic. You would immerse yourself in that area. And I did this as a journalist. So it was like, it struck me that you would basically could learn any topic because of your training and because of your persistence.
Right.
And
I was trained to do that. And that's what you learn in molecular biology graduate school, is how to read deeply. We were taught that you never read a scientific paper without reading the references to that paper. Not just looking at them. You go and you read the references to those papers, and then you read the references to those papers. Ooh, you learn a lot about bad science that way. You really do. And I was, that was my training. I thought it was normal. That's how I was trained. So that was how I approached the first nutrition class. And, I like to say it was like falling in love. I've never looked back. It was just the most wonderful teaching experience. I had this fabulous class. In those days, sophomore students could do research papers and do really good research papers. I mean, they knew how to do it too. They really taught me a lot. And I only did that. In fact, they liked it so much that 20 of the 50 students asked for a second semester, and the department was flexible enough to let me teach a second semester. So that by the end of that year, I knew quite a bit about nutrition. I mean,
This is
I
a quote
really
from the
did.
book. This is a quote from the book, which I thought really struck me about nutrition studies. It said that this is a quote, no matter what topics the students chose, their papers all concluded that the studies they have found were poorly designed and controlled, used too few subjects to draw meaningful conclusions, and did not justify the conclusions drawn from them. And I just wanted you to talk for a moment just about the prisoner studies and what people what they were working on, because it fascinated me and struck me as wow,
Yeah. So what hooked me on nutrition? I mean, on the first day that I started studying to prepare for this class, I had a bunch of textbooks and I opened them all up to the page that listed human nutrition requirements, and the lists were different. So this is interesting. How come the lists are different? Well, some of the books considered conditionally essential nutrients to be essential, things that are made by bacteria in the intestine, like vitamin K. Some of them thought that other factors were essential, some that were essential for animals but not humans. So there were variations in that. I thought that was interesting. So I went to the library and looked and got the recommended dietary allowances book, which at that time was a little thin pamphlet of about 70 pages. Now it's a library full of books. And I started reading the original papers on which the human nutrition requirements were established. And the first paper I looked at was this study of the vitamin thiamine that was done, a deficiency study that was done in a mental hospital. And they had 6 women who were inmates of this mental hospital who were put on thiamine deficient diets. And the assay that they used to tell whether they had a deficiency disease or not was their level of cooperation with chores around the hospital. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. This is a study on which the thiamine requirement is based. And I thought, well, let's look at another one. And I mean, this was totally random. And I picked vitamin C. And here, there was a study done on, I think, 8 prisoners in Kansas State Penitentiary or Iowa, or some Midwestern school, some Midwestern state. And during the study, 2 of the prisoners escaped. And I thought,
I'm not laughing at that, but I just think it's laughable. The studies, it's laughable.
Yeah, this is not a well-controlled clinical trial. I thought, oh, this is fabulous. You could teach this to students. You could teach, I was teaching in the biology department, that you could teach students critical thinking in biology by using studies like this in a way that's much easier than giving them original papers in molecular biology, which are written in a completely different language, are very abstract and hard to understand. Anybody could understand this. And that's what we did in this class. I had them read original papers in nutrition and criticize them. And the other point about those papers that was so amazing was that no matter how critical they were of whatever the relationship was, they were writing papers about the relationship about some nutrient to disease, fat and heart disease, vitamin C in the common cold, whatever. And no matter what they were writing about, at the end of it, they said they would take vitamin C for the common cold, even though they had just proven that.
These were the students that would say that after even, yeah.
Yeah, so that taught me that nutrition has an enormous emotional component in it that you have to take into consideration if you're talking about dietary advice. I really learned a lot from teaching that class.
And then you went to it was considered, your words, a spouse of hire, UCSF Medical School, and you taught nutrition to medical school students, and that's where you wrote your first book to sort of compile how to teach these students nutrition in clinical practice, which is hard to get a copy of, by the way. And I think that I guess my question is, and then you wrote something I think in 2014 or more recent about nutrition education in schools. We just did this Food is Medicine report, where we found that nutrition and food as treatment and so forth is still lacking in medical schools. Can you talk about your experience there, and also your experience in teaching medical school students, and what's going on in the state of medical school students in nutrition education now?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it hasn't changed. The At the time that I started teaching nutrition at UCSF, which was in the late 70s or early 1980s, it had been 20 years since the American Medical Association had had its first major conference on nutrition education in medical schools, and nothing had changed in that 20 years, because the basic structural determinants haven't changed. Our healthcare system is based on treatment, not prevention. Nutrition is a preventive strategy. And it's looked down on, first of all, because the evidence for any one diet or one food or whatever is highly problematic, because nutrition studies are extraordinarily difficult to do. I can make fun of them and that kind of thing, but in fact, the science is extraordinarily difficult because people eat such complicated diets. And the difference between what you eat on day one and day two is enormous, and even bigger than the difference between what I eat and what you eat. It's almost, I think the most intellectually important question in the field of nutrition is how to find out what people are eating. It's really hard unless you're locking them in a metabolic ward and measuring every single thing and locking them so that they can't cheat, because everybody will given the opportunity. It's just really hard, and so medicine looks down on it as something that's not scientific, emotional. It causes a lot of trouble. It's just like the FDA. Food causes a lot of trouble. We don't want to deal with it, and so that the students were really interested, because every single patient that they encountered had questions about their diet. Should I eat this? Should I eat that? And the students, learned about nutrition from popular culture, just like everybody else learns about nutrition from popular culture. I had hours in the curriculum in which but I was told that I was supposed to be teaching about vitamins and the biochemistry of vitamins, which I'm happy to do, it's interesting. And they probably need to know that, because eventually they will run across patients who have biochemical abnormalities in the way they handle vitamins, although those conditions are rare. But nobody was teaching about the effects of diet on chronic disease, or chronic malnutrition, or any of the really big issues in diet and health, of which the most important is obesity-related chronic diseases. That's the big one, and nobody teaches about it because it's fraught. In addition to being difficult, nobody knows what to do about it, because the problems are social and political and economic and behavioral, and all of those things that are very, very difficult to deal with. You want to fix diet-related chronic disease among the poor. You've got to fix their neighborhoods. You've got to give them money. You've got to make sure they've got jobs and education. That's a societal problem.
Yeah,
Um,
and it almost kind of, when you think about it, for the medical students, they have so much to learn, to learn, to start thinking about social issues, uh, is probably overwhelming for, medical school curriculum. I think it should be, but it's overwhelming probably from a
Well,
curriculum.
it's there and it certainly comes up, but it's not a focus. There are no questions about nutrition on the national boards, or at the time there were none. I think there may be one or two now. But when I was asked to, I mean, I was sent from JAMA Internal Medicine. I was sent this paper by a Harvard medical student who discovered that there's no nutrition education in medical schools. And I was sent this paper to read. I just laughed when I read it because I had seen papers like this for 45 years, and I got the physician at UCSF who had been a medical student when I started teaching there, and who I'd worked with very, very closely to co-author this editorial with me. And he maintains that as medical education is changing to try to teach medical students to work in teams, that nutrition will play a greater role, but I have yet to see any evidence of that.
Yeah.
And now that doctors have 15 minutes with patients, if you're lucky, you get 15 minutes with a doctor, and he looks up from his, or she looks up from her computer. If you're lucky, it's hopeless.
Yeah, I tend to agree, having just looked at this topic. Then from UCSF, there was a dean change, and people could read this in the book because it's fascinating. And
I got fired.
You got fired. Well, let's not say fired, because what you negotiated, I'm still so impressed with how you did this.
Oh,
Um,
I was
yeah,
lucky.
yeah,
I
no,
was so
no.
lucky.
You got some great advice about how to approach. There was a dean change. You realized at that point you were a spousal hire, and with the dean change, you realized that they were just squeezing you out, and you negotiated this fascinating deal. If you could just mention that, and uh,
I had really good advice. I had been given the title of associate dean in the School of Medicine at UCSF, a very fancy title, but I had no portfolio, so it was an empty title. And I had to figure out what my own job was and create my own job. And I kept that going for 8 years. I still look back on that as some kind of a miracle that I was able to keep that going that long. And when the dean who had done the spousal hire left and a new dean came in, his first question to me was, "I don't understand what you're doing here." Yeah, and we were off and running. And that it did not go well from then on. And when it became clear that uh, that this just wasn't going to work, and I was in tears all the time. I mean, I was really, really upset. My marriage was breaking up at the same time. It was not a happy period in my life. I went to someone for advice, who was a very wise and kind man who worked at the medical school, Phil Lee, who had been an assistant secretary for health a couple of times. And there's a health policy institute at UCSF named after him for good reason. He founded it. And I went to see him, and I told him what was going on and how I was being squeezed out and my office was being moved further away and all of that kind of thing. And he said, when new deans come in, it's a political appointment, and you should have had a letter of resignation sitting on his desk on the day he arrived. Well, nobody told me that. So he said, "You have to resign." Well, that got more tears. And he said, and then he said, "And here's how you do it." And he said, "Everything at universities is negotiable. You need to go to the dean and tell him that you realize things are not working out, and ask him to help you with the next stage of your career." And he said, "I think you should go to public health school." you need a degree in, you need some kind of credential in nutrition. You're teaching nutrition without a credential. That doesn't work in academic institutions. Go to public health school and get a degree, and ask the dean for 2 years of salary support, and promise the dean that you will disappear at the end of the 2 years. So, I mean, I was stunned. I had no idea that such things were possible. And it took me quite a while to work up the courage to do it. But in fact, when I went in to see the dean and said, I'd like you to help me with the next stage of my career, and I want 2 years of salary support, it took him he sort of gasped. And it took him about 10 seconds to think that it was a really good idea, because I was the only woman among 20 associate deans. And I was the only one who didn't have tenure. I was in an untenured position. And it could be awkward. You know, if I made a fuss, it could be awkward. And so he agreed to it. And he said he had to talk to the business manager. By the time I got back to my office, there was a note on my desk saying a letter would be forthcoming. And that's what happened. And so I had 2 years of salary support to pull my life together, to go to public health school, which was a wonderful experience, absolutely wonderful experience in every possible way. He had promised me that it would open doors. Boy, did it ever. And that was really the beginning of the next stage where things started to get better.
Right, and then you went and got a job in Washington.
Yeah, that was a public health job.
Yeah, your first public health job. You worked to develop the Surgeon General report that was supposed to be out in 1988, I guess.
Came out in 1988.
Right. So this was your first, your first government job.
And only.
And only. And you were surprised about a few things. Certainly about how they talked about food versus ingredients and your struggles there. Can you talk briefly about how they approached food, and what happened there?
Yeah, I was hired as, with another really fancy title, a senior nutrition policy advisor in the Department of Health and Human Services. I was in the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, which is the office that does the dietary guidelines, the physicians services task force, the 2020, 2030, 2040 health objectives for the nation. All that stuff came out of that office. And my job was to get the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health out, which I had been promised would happen very quickly, and in fact took 2 years, 2 more years. It had been in the works for a long time. It was very controversial. Nobody wanted it. It was just like the White House conference that was just held. Nobody wanted that conference, but there it was. And I'd come there from Berkeley. I was a little vague on the difference between Republicans and Democrats. Oh, I learned that one very quickly. And I also was vague on the difference between Health and Human Services and the Department of Agriculture. I learned that one very quickly too. And, I was told this is a story I discussed in my book, Food Politics. On the first day I was on the job, I was told that no matter what the research said, the Surgeon General's report would never say eat less of any food, particularly meat, because if it said eat less meat, the Department of Agriculture would go to Congress and the report would never come out. And, that was not a paranoid fantasy. That was a reality check. And I was in trouble all the time on that job. I was just in constant trouble. It's very important in Washington to never say what you think. And that's not in my DNA. So you're never supposed to say what you think, because then you come across as partisan. You're not allowed to be partisan if you're working for an agency. And I was just in trouble all the time for saying things and sometimes doing things that I wasn't supposed to. I couldn't believe how restrictive it was to work for the government. There were so many ethics rules, and I was in an office where those ethics rules were absolutely held to the highest possible standard. And I thought that was great, but it sure made life difficult. And I could understand why there were so many breaches of ethics, because they're really hard to, it's really hard to live that way. But we did, or we tried.
And they're
And
portioning out. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just going to say that there was one other thing that I learned, and that was about the divisions in Washington. Was that everybody fell into two categories: those who liked New York better than Washington, and those who liked Washington better than New York. Oh, I found out which category I was in very quickly, and started looking for jobs in New York.
And then you started looking for a job after that, because that was a sort of a specific hire, the Washington job, and working for the government. And
yeah, it was a 2-year appointment.
2-year appointment. And so after that, now I think you're looking for a job, and you found colleagues sent you this, and also you discovered this job at NYU. And
chairing a department of home economics.
Chairing the department and hotel management, right? And it was in there. And it was interesting because you did get hired as a tenured professor, as a full professor, but the original offer, which was shocking, was untenured and as an associate professor, which I went and checked again in the book that you described that, and that you kind of went back and negotiated to get a tenured full professor position at NYU.
Well, the job had been offered as a tenured full professor position. So I had gone and interviewed for it, expecting that that was what it would be. And when they offered an untenured associate professorship to come up for tenure within 3 years in a department that I was being asked to chair to change, I was being asked to change that department from home economics into something more modern. And there were 3 tenured professors in the department who liked it the way it was.
Right.
That wasn't going to work. I was going to get eaten alive.
So just for clarity for people that are listening, so when you went back to school to get your MPH, you were 50?
Oh, at least. Yeah.
At least 50. Okay. So now you're at NYU going for this job as your first, tenured. And how old are you now after your Washington job?
After the Washington job? I mean, I went to NYU, I think I was 52 when I went to NYU. Is that
as
right?
inspiration for those of us who are older, it's pretty inspiring to know that you basically, changed your life at that age. And then
well, when Food Politics came out, I was 66.
Which is incredible. I keep reminding
myself.
So you go to this program at NYU, and you hadn't come up with the idea yet for food studies, so it was still home economics, hotel management. I remember you telling the story about the NYU's dirty kitchen, and I thought that was interesting. And then also, so again, this is where you say you started your journey in food and nutrition, basically, and where you started to feel free to be able to be who you are today. But so you got there, and I think the NYU Dirty Kitchen story is sort of representative of what you walked into. That was for me anyway.
Yeah, my faculty were nutritionists, and they were all members of the American Dietetic Association, which I started late in a semester. I didn't come in, semester start in September, but the government job I was on wouldn't let me leave until the end of my contract, which was at the end of September. And that was just as well, because I wouldn't have known what to do anyway at the beginning of the semester. So I started at the beginning of October, and they were all off at an American Dietetics Association meeting. So I went around and did get acquainted visits. I went and started meeting people. Hi, I'm the new chair. Nice to meet you. And one after another of the people I was meeting with said the same thing. We're so glad you're here. They really need you. Oh, I just hate to bring this up when you've only just arrived, but there's just something I have to bring to your attention. And I heard this over, and when I heard it for and everybody said exactly the same thing. So I said, what is it? And your kitchen is dirty. And I thought, my kitchen is dirty. So the department had a teaching kitchen. So I thought, well, maybe I better go look at it. It was in another building. So I went into the other building. I got off the elevator, and I tell you, I could smell it. I could smell it. And there was this just awful odor. And I walk into this kitchen, and dirty didn't describe it. I mean, it was one of these Leona Helmsley things where you could put your finger on, and if you ran your finger over the counter, you left a groove and there was evidence of wildlife everywhere, mouse turds covering the thing, cockroaches everywhere. It was absolutely shocking. And I thought, here I am. I have a degree in molecular biology. I have a master's in public health. And I've just taken over a department, and my first job is to clean a kitchen. How am I going to do that?
Well, and you ended up getting the money, and it was amazing that some of the convection ovens were never even plugged in or used.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and it kind of is metaphoric for what you ended up doing with this program. And
Well, it was neglected. It was an enormously neglected program that made a lot of money for NYU, but the students were neglected, the faculty were neglected, and the physical facilities everything was neglected. So I could see why they wanted somebody to come and make changes, and those changes needed to be made very badly. And they were eventually made, although very slowly. Took a while.
yeah, and I guess it was symbolic in some ways of you cleaning that up, and then developing the food studies program. And I wanted to mention this one. This is from your book. It says, one speaker, John Pierce, a cancer researcher at the University of California, San Diego, particularly got my attention. I guess this is in 1991, after you started at NYU. He showed examples of cigarette advertising like Joe Camel, the Joe Camel character, that targeted children. I was well aware of those ads, but I had never paid close attention to them. Cigarette advertising was ubiquitous and a normal part of the everyday landscape. This was my aha moment. I turned to Jane Brody, who is, for those of you who don't know, was the New York Times science writer for forever, and said, quote, "We ought to be doing this for Coca-Cola." And that was sort of your start of looking at this perspective of food marketing and food companies and how they're influencing our choices.
Yeah, I was tired. I became tired of going to meetings and hearing people talk about childhood obesity, and say, how are we going to get mothers to feed their kids better? As if, and nobody was saying, how are we going to get the food industry to stop marketing junk food to our kids? Nobody was saying that. And it was obvious to me at that aha moment that we ought to be scrutinizing the way in which food companies are marketing junk foods, especially to children. And it wasn't that I didn't know that this was going on. It was that I never paid attention to it. So I started paying attention, and that was the genesis of Food Politics, which came out in 2002. So I spent the next 10 years paying attention and writing articles, and finally figured out it would be good to do a book. Took a while.
But just we don't have that much time, but I want to really be clear, like especially for this audience, that you found the food studies program, you reconditioned and reformatted and developed this entire idea of studying food in its entirety, which was pretty novel at the time, and still is to this day, of nutritionists and dietitians really looking at food as opposed to nutrients. So and I thought that was just incredible. And in fact, you said in your book, it was really kind of cute and interesting about Julia Child, who saw you as the enemy of good tasting food. You were invited to dinner at her house. and then, and that was, you said, was awkward. And then you asked her for suggestions on faculty because you're trying to, develop this food studies program. And what she wrote back was really interesting too. I don't know if you remember this, but
Yeah, no, I mean, she just didn't like nutritionists at all. She thought all the focus on nutrients had ruined food for everybody. And it took her a long time to realize that I liked food too.
so this is something that, it was thematic for me when I was reading the book, and I wonder if this is related to gender issues. I think it is, but it's your opinion that matters most. You've been called bossy. I'm paraphrasing: bossy, dictatorial, hard to work with. At the Washington D.C. job, I think at University of California, that was an issue too. And then you had sort of this. Your staff basically felt like you at NYU, I guess the faculty had said some. And so do you think that that's related? I mean, I thought it was related to gender, but again, I'm a white male, and I just thought, I wonder if, if this was gender related, or if you had thought that or dismissed it, or what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was hired to make change. So that's always at NYU. That was why they hired me. They thought I could transform the department into something for the 20th, if not the 21st century. And people don't like change. It's uncomfortable. So if you're going to make change and get anything done, you've got to push and find ways to do it. I'm sure I could have done it more diplomatically. I think that, yeah, it's easier for men to do that kind of thing because that pushing behavior is more expected from men than from women. Certainly by the time the faculty rebelled and I stepped down as chair, but I had been chair for much too long anyway. I was chair for 15 years. That's way too long at an academic institution. And so that was, again, my not really watching and reading the tea leaves. But by the time the faculty rebelled and just said, we really can't take this anymore, things were in pretty good shape. And I was happy to step down and be given the cushiest academic job that anybody could ever have, where I was teaching one class a semester and could use my time to write, and produced all those books afterwards. There have actually been 15 books, Charles, and 14 of them have been since 2002. Some were edited, some were edited. There were a couple of edited books too. But so I could spend my time writing and speaking and traveling, which was a good thing because I was getting lots of speaking invitations. And it would have been hard to do that.
You said that, I guess, the first year, this is also was really good advice, I thought, about your presentation style, how I guess it was a projectionist that basically made a comment to you. You should be you have a lot less words on your slides. I wish I could tell some of my students that story. But, that basically you developed your style from a little bit of criticism that you had received from, was a projectionist or?
Yeah. Yeah, no, but I mean, sometimes I do things that are that really took a lot of courage. And my first public talk was to an audience of 1,200 people with a Nobel Prize winner on the podium, sitting next to me, Linus Pauling on the podium. And I was so terrified by that experience. I mean, I rehearsed that talk for 6 weeks ahead of time. I think I lost 10 pounds because I couldn't eat for weeks and weeks and weeks. I was so scared. And the talk went okay. It was an hour-long introduction to nutrition. My first public talk was an hour-long talk. And I got through it, but then people asked questions and I didn't know how to answer questions. And that was very, very awkward and uncomfortable. And I got feedback from the projectionist that was very useful. He told me how to do slides. It was pre-PowerPoint, it was long before PowerPoint, and how to do slides. And I followed his advice ever since. It's worked. Yeah.
And
No words, few
no,
words.
well, you're an incredible speaker, and then you went on to do hundreds of speaking engagements a year. And you said you accepted anything at the
Mm.
time just to get experience, which I thought was phenomenal. So just we have just a few minutes remaining, and I wanted to ask you this. I've asked you this twice before, and I'll ask it again. In an interview with PBS many years ago, you said that after 50 years of nutritional advice, the public was more confused than ever. And I asked you that, I think, about 10 years ago. I asked it to you 5 years ago, and I'm going to ask it to you today. Has that changed?
I don't think so. Judging from what I'm hearing from people, is they're still confused about what to eat. But I think a lot of that, but I think that the people that I talk to are really concerned about the environment. That's new. The environmental considerations in food choices are new within the last 5 or 10 years. The obvious problems about hunger and chronic disease have not changed, and people still don't know what to do to avoid them. And I think it still has to do with the enormous effort that's put into food marketing to try to convince people that this food is healthy and that food is healthy. And now we have the FDA defining healthy for us.
Yeah,
I mean, the mind boggles.
yeah, and it's interesting because some of the headlines are, "Oh, finally, we're getting a definition for the term healthy," which in your opinion?
Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Michael Collins said it better than anybody. I think that's really all there is to it. I think dietary advice is really easy. You just don't eat a lot of junk food. It helps a lot. And we now know that junk foods in the what's the ultra processed category encourage people to take in too many calories, to eat more than they should, and don't realize it. So we now have a reason why junk food should be consumed in very small quantities. So to me, it's easy if you eat real food, and which unfortunately for a lot of people means that you have to know how to cook. But cooking can be fun, and I'm for it. Teach kids to cook. Teach kids
Yeah,
to cook.
that's something big in life. People probably don't know this about you, that you love cooking, and that you actually worked on The Joy of Cooking and a revised. You got to read the book. The audience, you got to read the book. It's a very quick read, where you hear about Marion Nestle working on The Joy of Cooking, and
lots of pictures.
and also it's interesting because I was talking to my wife, and after I was reading the book, and she saw me like obsessing over it, and I said, I wish I had this at the beginning of my career. And she said, why? I said, well, I always felt like I was alone as a journalist writing about food, and had great experts like you helping me. But if I had known, if I had pulled the veil apart and saw what you were seeing as you were going through this, it would have changed potentially my perspective. Because I was always fighting to get information around calories and nutrients from food companies, and always had difficulty and couldn't understand why. And after reading this book, I go, oh yeah, I know it now, but God, I wish I had this then. And I really, thank you for writing it, and thank you for all the writing that you've done. And also this whole concept of your over preparation for everything is a constant theme in your work, and how you were really self-taught in so many ways. And it's encouraging for those out there that are interested in learning how to learn, and being able to, especially with the internet, and being able to capture so many things out there, and being cautious about what you read and what you look at. But still, there's so much available. So this is some questions that I asked you a long time ago, and I want to make sure they're still accurate. Your last meal, you said, would be a really good ice cream with berries. Is that
I think that's probably a fair answer.
And that your favorite junk food was Haagen-Dazs vanilla frozen yogurt. Has that changed?
Oh, which they don't make anymore.
Oh, they don't even make it anymore.
No longer available. I complained to the Nestle. I met some officer at Nestle, no relation, and said, what happened to it? And nobody else bought it except me, so they stopped making it.
Well, I also wanted to note that there's a discount if you'd like to buy the book, which I encourage you. If you go to ucpress.edu and look up Dr. Nestle's book and use this code 21W2240, I'll repeat it, 21W2240 at checkout. I think there's a 30% discount, which is incredible. And again, this is not to promote, she doesn't need you to buy her book, but the book is excellent and it reads really well and really fast. And I really think it would be important for everybody that's in food policy or related to food policy to read it. Lastly, please check out and make sure you check out nycfoodpolicy.org and sign up for our weekly news digest. Also, foodmedcenter.org and sign up for the Food is Medicine newsletter. They're both excellent and done every week in their news digests. And again, Marion Nestle, it's just such a pleasure to know you. You inspired me to be who I am and so many others. You're always listed on our 40 under 40 as the most inspiring person. And thank you. And I look forward to having more conversations with you.
Oh, I hope so. Thanks, Charles. This was fun.
Okay, stay well, everybody.